All right, so we have Brian Taylor here. Thank you for joining us, Brian. You were with us for episode 75. Great to have you back here for episode 100. So, real quick, just wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself again and tell the audience who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for having me on. My name is Brian Taylor. I'm the director of audiology at Signia. I also am the editor for Audiology Practices, which is the ADA publication, comes out 4 times a year. I've been doing that for about 15 years. And then, along with you and a lot of other great people, work at Hearing Health and Technology Matters, This Week in Hearing, write some things from them as an editor at large. So, longtime audiologist, and it's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me back.
Absolutely. Yeah. This week in hearing has been a lot of fun. I know that I just recorded one of these with Amin and Lonnie, and that's just been a lot of fun building that channel and bringing more and more people into the mix of, having different hosts and different topics covered. So if anyone's unaware, there's another podcast that myself and others do called This Week in Hearing. So be sure to check that out. But wanted to just bring you on, like I said, for episode 100 and get your thoughts on kind of what's top of mind for you. You've been having a ton of really interesting conversations on This Week in Hearing, so I'm sure some of that might dovetail into our conversation today. But just share with us like what's on your radar right now, and in terms of kind of like what's kind of getting you excited, or at least just coming top of mind for you.
Yeah, sure. I can think of a few different things. Number one, I think that automation is starting to really change how we practice audiology in a big way. Automated testing, self-fitting hearing aids. I think those are some really interesting areas that take away maybe some of the mundane aspects of what we do in the clinic. Puts them in the hands of the patient, maybe with some clinician oversight. I think about an audiogram, and the traditional assessment can take about 30 minutes. Well, I think we have tools out there now that not only shorten the time, but provide a test that's just as accurate as what comes from an experienced audiologist. So I think you're going to see more of a ramp up around that. I think that the same thing with hearing aids, when it comes to programming and adjusting, I think, if you can put those tools into the hands of a patient and they can do it just as, or maybe even more effectively than what a clinician does, that's great. That frees up time for us to spend it empowering our patients, guiding them through the process of change, all those really important things that are needed for somebody to be a successful hearing aid wearer. Anyway, that's one area that I think is really exciting.
Yeah, let's actually just pause here. We can keep going, but let's unpack this one a little bit, because I do think this whole point around automation is really interesting. And I'm curious to get your thoughts. So as we move toward a world where, like you said, some of the day-to-day tasks that have historically been a part of the hearing professionals day-to-day, as more of those potentially get automated, it seemingly would free up more of their time. So where do you think that time can be spent?
Yeah, well, I think you think about people that have had a hearing loss for a long time. For an example, take an average 75-year-old person who's maybe been dealing with a hearing loss for 20 or more years. It gives you more time to talk about why they've acquired some of these maladaptive behaviors and how you can go about trying to more effectively change and improve upon those behaviors that they've acquired because they haven't been able to hear for a long time. I think when it comes to helping a person wear new devices, there's all kinds of opportunities to make it more customizable. Focus exactly on what's getting in the way of that person being a successful hearing aid wearer. I think those are helping. I'm starting to really wrap my head around this whole concept of empowerment, what it means in the clinic, the process of empowerment, the concept of what an empowered person looks like. I think there's all kinds of opportunities for audiologists to help a person become more empowered, help paint the picture of what it looks like to be an empowered individual that wears hearing aids. And that's completely shifting away from the X's and O's of the audiogram and all the programming that's needed. I mean, obviously, all the X's and O's and the programming is important, but if you can automate it, put it in the hands of the consumer in an easy to use format, why not do that and let the audiologist practice on the individual and some of the characteristics, behaviors that drive that individual.
I love too how you said that, with this, you're going to have, empowering the patient. And the first thing that really comes to mind with everything that you're saying is like this trend that's underway right now where you have these, like platforms like iOS, you have in Apple Health, you can upload your audiogram. And, I think about how it's such a black box today. You go into the audiologist, chances are you're going to get you're going to get a test, but then you're going to get like an audiogram, which might be a little bit not so user friendly. It might be kind of confusing for them to read. So they're sort of they're at the whims of like, I need to come in periodically and hear from you in terms of what's going on with my health. And I would challenge like that whole approach. Like if you actually provided the patient with a clear understanding of here's exactly where your hearing sits today. And I think the promise of something like Apple Health having like this ability to upload audiograms, and maybe down the line you can consistently repopulate that doing an online test or something like that, is you can start to compare sort of like a year over year analysis of like, okay, maybe I can start to visibly see some of the deterioration in my health. And none of that, in my opinion, detracts from the role of the professional, which was never necessarily just to provide the test. It's to make sense of it. It's to provide that assessment. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
just one real small example of this, of that empowerment, like you mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I'll just tell you, there was a study published like a month ago. Judy Dubno, research audiologist, University of North Carolina Medical Center, was the lead author. It looked at hearing screening. And it really, I think, showed in a compelling way that there's a number of really well-designed, many of them automated hearing screening tools out there that show a person, yes, I have a hearing loss, but if you don't have a person involved in explaining and getting and helping the person kind of paint the picture of why they need to take the next step, why it's important to go in for a more elaborate assessment, why it might be important to acquire hearing aids, if that professional is not involved in the equation, the uptake of moving to the next step is really low. A lot of people will take the test, they'll get the results, but without the professional involved in it, explaining the why, they just don't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think that's like the exciting part about this is that if ultimately, you're focusing more on freeing up time to focus on the why, whether it be through more time in a consultation, more consultations in general, because you're not having to spend time doing the what, more or less, like executing the actual test itself and all of the manpower that goes along with that. I think that it ultimately allows for the provider to actually free up more time on their pure value proposition to begin with, which is their consultation and expertise. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that, again, it's like, this is just one specific example, is the hearing test itself, but I can see how there's a series of this will apply as more forms of the day-to-day gets automated. It's not as if that time just evaporates. That time will get reallocated. And I think that's what's really exciting now, is that we kind of have a little bit of a blank canvas as an industry. I think a lot of providers are sort of grappling with this right now, is like, okay, so if you're telling me that in a 40-hour work week, I'm going to get 6 hours back, over the course of the next 1 to 2 years, through automation, through a variety of different automations, like what would I do with those 6 hours? And I think that there's a lot of people at a crossroads right now trying to make that decision. Do you go into more ancillary part of the overall scope and you kind of double down in that area? Do you broaden, the services that you provide? So it's a more holistic offering, and that's going to be part of the way that you differentiate your market. So all of this, I think, is to say that there's not like a real clear definitive answer. I think there's a variety of different things that you can pursue, but they all sort of are culminating, I think, around this fact that you're going to have more time freed up in the clinic.
I hope so. And I think one of the dilemmas, and I don't really have the answer to this, is you got this extra time freed up now. You can see patients and do different things. Are you going to be reimbursed for that? I think that's an issue
Right.
that we have to tackle as a profession. It would be it lobbying in Congress or working with third-party payers, but they have to be able to see the value of our provision of those counseling like services, that it's more than just fitting a hearing aid or doing a hearing test. And that's going to be a real challenge, I think.
So you had mentioned before we jumped in and kind of unpacked that one, it sounded like you were going to continue going. So what else is on your radar?
Yeah, there's a few other things. I think that kind of along the lines we've been talking about here, I think that you're going to see the elimination, or at least maybe the easing of some of these silos around cochlear implants. That's the one I think about the most. Where now since implants have been around for 30 or so years, there's been audiologists that have kind of specialized in that. Very small, select few of audiologists that were only involved in implants, and I think now maybe because we're forced to because of some of these market changes in the market. But I think audiologists, hearing care professionals in general, really need to take a more holistic approach and be involved in not only the day-to-day of routine audiology care, but also cochlear implants, especially for adults. The candidacy requirements have broadened. A lot of people that have severe, profound hearing loss that really struggle with their hearing aids don't even know that they're cochlear implant candidates. And that shows you there's kind of a disconnect between what the experts are saying around candidacy requirements and what's happening in the field. And I think we just have to broaden our scope of practice and make sure that we're involved in that. And that's one end of the equation. And I think on the other end of the equation, it's our involvement in OTC and self-fitting hearing aids. The way I look at it, it's a great opportunity to broaden the number of people out there that would need our help with having OTC as part of in your toolbox. And I think of the world, OTC happening, self-fitting hearing aids happening, that you can kind of divide patients into two categories. People that want good enough and they're willing to maybe buy it off the shelf, maybe buy it off your website. They're okay with it not being, optimal benefit. They get by. It helps them in situations where they really need it, and they're perfectly okay with that. And then I think there's another category of patients that want customizable, optimal benefit. They want to spend more time. They're willing to spend more money to get expert care and attention from a licensed professional. And I think having OTC in your toolbox allows you to work in both of those buckets: people that want good enough and people that want customizable care.
I like all that. I think that it's focusing on the two bookends, if you will, of the spectrum, because I do think that there's a lot going on there. I mean, I've never mentioned it on the podcast, but the whole I'm blanking on the word here, for cochlear implants, the new rules, more or less. Can you speak to that really quick in terms of, because this is a really big deal?
Well, I think it's important to remember that pediatric guidelines are different than adult guidelines when it comes to cochlear implants. And I think pediatric audiology is a different, almost a separate set of expertise, a separate set of skills. And so I'm not going to speak to that. But with respect to adults, it's called the 60/60 guidelines. If the pure tone average is worse than 60 dB, if the word recognition score is worse than 60%, that would be two indications that the patient is a candidate for a cochlear implant evaluation. And that would prompt a referral to a center that does cochlear implants. And so if you're a professional, if the patient meets those two criteria, they should be referred somewhere in your area where they can get a CI evaluation. It doesn't mean they're going to get a cochlear implant, but it means they would go through the process to see if they're a candidate. And then I know that Cochlear Americas has a really interesting program where the referring audiologist is actually still involved in the fitting or the mapping, the programming, and the follow-up. They have an interesting program that I think audiologists I think more and more of them know about it, but it's a really good program that kind of keeps them involved in the process. But the bottom line is there are a lot of people, a lot of adults out there that struggle with their hearing aids that are in this category that don't even know that they might be a cochlear implant candidate. And it's really imperative for the profession, for the professionals to be aware of those new guidelines and make the necessary referral for the CI eval.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, the thing that's going through my head here is how do you differentiate in this increasingly crowded market? And one, I think, pretty effective way to do that is to basically practice the full scope of audiology. And because you know that you can kind of go down the list of your competitors, and there's few competitor types that would be able to check all these different boxes. And that in and of itself, I think, is a strong point of differentiation, is that you sort of are a one-stop shop that can treat any variety of the people that come through your doors. And to your point, so you have the most sophisticated end of the spectrum being cochlear implants, and the highest degree of, basically medicalization necessary for that. But then on the other end, you have a lot of the OTC offering. And I think, like, with that, the big question is, like, how do you make it work financially? I think a lot of people are excited by this prospect of getting establishing the relationship early, knowing that this is usually a progressive thing, that people are going to just increasingly warrant your services over time. So it might be best to kind of like lock down that relationship early. But I think a lot of where the rubber meets the road is, like, how do you actually make it so that you can charge for this in such a way that is not only financially viable for you as the professional, but it's something that's compelling enough to where people will look at this and say, oh, okay, yes, I could go and I could do all this myself. And I could go into whichever name, big box retailer, whatever, or online retailer, and do this myself. There has to be some sort of value proposition of why you should go and see the professional, whether it be customization, like you said, and programming, something like that, consultation. So it seems to me that in all practicality, like, these things make sense, but it's a matter of how do you actually iron out the details, knowing the devil's usually in the details with how do you make this work. But the, I think, exciting thing is, like, everybody's kind of in this boat to a certain degree. And so I think that you're sort of seeing some of the early movers figuring this out. And I think that probably will ultimately kind of cascade down into the profession writ large.
Yeah, no, that's one of the real benefits of the free market economy, is that there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of potential disruption going on, and then folks need to pay attention to podcasts and webcasts like yours so they can kind of see what works and then implement that in their own practice.
Right. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with all those points. But anyway, Brian, thank you for coming on. Thanks for being a part of episode 100 here. Appreciate your help in getting me up to this milestone, and I'm looking forward
Yeah,
to.
congratulations, David.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that. So I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to all the upcoming
Yeah.
This Week in Hearing episodes that you're going to be doing. They've been
Yeah,
very
sounds good.
entertaining and enjoyable.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
the invite, and best of luck on the next 100 episodes.
Thanks, Brian.